Hey everyone, I'm Brian Parks, the CEO of Synapse Software, and in today's video I want to talk about collections and schemas in Slingshot. So in the previous videos I talked about some of the other very low level functionality in Slingshot. Specifically I talked about users and security groups. Now users and security groups mostly pertain to the permissions that a particular user or group of users has to collections. So what are collections? Well, if we look at the architectural diagram that I first showed in the conceptual deep dive of Slingshot, which I'll leave linked down in the description below, we can see that down in the storage layer, not only do we have users and security groups, but underpinning that we have collections. And that's how we talk directly to wherever the data is actually stored. And then schemas provide a validation layer and some other features, as we'll see, on top of collections. So let's get into a demo. So here I have my Slingshot instance set up, and here's the home page. And you'll notice here I have several different collections. These are all collections that I've defined in the system, and I did that by going to this Manage Collections button over here, and you can see all the collections that I have listed in the system. Now, you'll notice there are a lot more here than were actually visible on that first page. There's a reason for that, but we won't get into that in this video. But you can also see that there are some collections that are noticeably missing. Things like users and security groups, and several others that we'll talk about in future videos. Things like actions and APIs and that sort of thing. That's because those are system collections which can't be added, removed, or modified from the system. So it doesn't make sense to list them here because you can't actually edit the schema. They're kind of internal to the system, and there are actually checks in place to make sure that those system collections always exist, and when you go through updates there are things that automatically change to make sure that they remain up to date. But everything else you can modify. So even though you might start out with, say, a CRM kind of baseline implementation, you can still manage accounts, and you can edit the schema there. So let's start with accounts. Let's dive into there and kind of see what's configurable with a schema and a collection. There's a little bit of documentation here, but for the full documentation, go to our Slingshot docs site, and I'll leave the link to that in the description below. So right off the bat, we have a title field, and the importance of the title field is that's what shows up kind of in this title area. So if you actually pulled up a form, you would see the title of the record, which is pulled from that title field, displayed. Now, you don't have to name that field title, and that's why this setting exists. So you can actually select any field from the record, from the schema, and you can actually choose automatic, which I don't recommend, but if you're pulling in schemas from somewhere else and you didn't have a title field specified, it would automatically try to guess what the title field is. So it looks for fields called title, name. There are a few others, but those are the big ones. In this case, I've selected name because the name of an account makes sense for it to be kind of the title. And then I have multiple different fields. Now we'll get into exactly what each of these options means in just a second, but let's continue down the page. There's also relationships, which define how this collection relates to other collections, and you can see I have an activities relationship and a linked opportunities relationship. The target collection is the other collection at the other end of the relationship. So obviously for activities, the target collection is activities, and for linked opportunities, the target collection is opportunities. And then each one of them has a filter. And if you saw my video on permissions users and security groups, you'll notice this UI and the options here. It's basically all of them. None doesn't really make sense, but it is an option. And custom. Most filters will probably be custom because you'll want to use a custom expression to filter the items in the target collection that should show up in the relationship for this collection. So in this case, we say the target collection. The @ symbol is a shortcut for meaning the target collection. So in this case, the activity, its entity ID should equal my ID. Dollar is my particular record from this collection, and the entity type is accounts. So that basically means that any activity that is linked to an account whose ID is this account's ID should show up in that relationship. And similarly for linked opportunities. This is a text field right now. We're working on a UI for that to make it a little bit easier. But the documentation for expressions is on our documentation site, and we continue to improve that as well. Then there's two sections that relate to actions. Now, we haven't talked specifically about actions in any videos other than to mention that they exist. But in this section of the schema definition, you can link actions that should show up on lists of records, so in this case on lists of accounts, and you can select actions to show up on individual records, so when you go to the form to edit an account or to view an account. In this case, I have one that I've created text for reset all to new, and then another one, follow up in 2 weeks, follow up in a month. And this can be different from the name of the action. So here I've selected set all accounts to new prospect status. And that's a pretty good action name because it very clearly indicates what the functionality is. But on the list, I don't necessarily want to show set all accounts to new prospect status. A, I already know I'm on a list of accounts, and B, I don't really care about the implementation details. I just care about the end goal. So in this case, I specified the text as reset all to new, and that's good. And then after the action runs, because the action is a programmability feature, it doesn't necessarily have any UI associated with it, but I can choose to do something in the UI after that action runs. In this case, I don't do anything, I just stay where I currently was. But on the record actions, I choose to refresh the current record. And let's see what the options are here. So you can choose to do nothing, which is the default. Show output, which basically takes whatever the output of the action is and shows that on the screen. You can refresh the current record, which really only makes sense when you're on a record, so in this record actions section. You can go to a new record, which makes sense either place, and go to new record takes an option over here, which I'll show in just a minute, and then go to record indicated by action. And that's important as well. So this drop down is a list of collections, obviously, and this is what collection the ID that's specified by go to new record or go to record indicated by action, what collection that is an ID from. So in this case, for this record action, that doesn't really make sense, but let's say I had an action that created a new opportunity. I might want to go to record indicated by action and then choose opportunities as the collection that it relates to. So that would send me to the opportunities screen for that particular ID. And because that is a record that can be accessed via the UI, via URL, it would update the URL to that particular record. So it would actually end up being /UI/opportunities/ that new ID. So following with the principle that everything in Slingshot is built on top of very simple self-contained building blocks, that carries through here. Everything is addressable via a URL. So go to a particular record is basically go to a URL constructed from these building blocks. So let's go back up to what I think most people will be editing most of the time, the fields section. So there are a lot of different options here, but by laying it out in a table and only showing the options that are relevant to a particular field, I think we've captured a simple way to approach things. So first up, every field needs a type. And let's see what kind of types we have in the system. We have any, which basically means it can be whatever, text, integer, basically whole number, decimal, and this is using floating point decimals. It's not fixed point decimals. So if you're doing things like monetary calculations, I don't recommend using that data type. We can go into more detail about that in a future video. True and false, Boolean, GUID, which is used for IDs in the system. You probably wouldn't use this for your own data necessarily, but you'll see how it relates to relationships and a concept called foreign keys, which if you're familiar with how databases work, the term foreign key is probably familiar to you. List, which is literally just a list of items. And this is where we really get into the power of how Slingshot manages its data. List and object are both different from your typical relational database. So list is literally a list of items. Object is a more complex structure of fields, structure of information. And accounts doesn't have a field of type object, so I'll actually go into another collection that does and show you what that looks like in just a minute. And then date and time, and then enum. We've actually seen enum before in the how to build a service catalog video, but let's pull up this enum here. When you have an enum field, you get this ellipsis button where you can specify the values that show up in the enumeration. So in this case, new, contacted, connected, opportunity, customer, and ex-customer are my enum values. Now, depending on what type of field you have selected, you get different options. So text fields can be multi-line or not, and that basically indicates whether they should show up in the UI with a text area or just a single line text field. That also impacts whether they show up by default in lists. Multi-line text fields do not, whereas non-multi-line or single line text fields do show up there. And that's just the default list. In the future, we'll be giving you the ability to customize how lists show up. So you could potentially add a multi-line text field, but by default, multi-line text fields do not show up in lists. And then, of course, you'll see some fields have a drop-down in this foreign key column. So let's look at, let's start with created by and updated by, because those are actually pretty interesting fields. So created by and updated by, they are of type GUID, which again I mentioned, GUID fields are primarily used to hold the ID of a record from another collection. So in this case, created by holds the GUID of what collection? A user. So from this drop-down, you can select any collection, including system collections, and that indicates how this GUID will be treated. So what collection should we look for that GUID in? So if I wanted created by to actually be, say, a contact, I could change that to contacts. That doesn't actually make sense in this context, so I'll change it back to users. But you can have any collection be used as a foreign key. Now, there are also many options here that are common to all field types. Visibility has a few options. It can be editable, which is the default. It can be read-only, which doesn't actually mean read-only period. It means it is only editable by system level processes. So you'll actually see read-only fields actually created by and updated by are a good example of this. You can't edit them through the UI, and you can't actually edit them through the REST API either, but they can be set via default values and update on every save, which we'll dive into in a little more detail in just a minute. So that's the importance of read-only fields. And then hidden fields don't show up in the UI at all. So read-only fields show up in the UI, but they're just read-only. They just show their value. Hidden fields don't show up in the UI at all. But again, they can still be edited. And in fact, hidden fields can be edited through the REST API. So a little bit of different capabilities there. Now, required is pretty straightforward. A required field has to have a value in order for you to save the record or in order for you to create the record. And that is true both through the UI and through the REST API. Hashed is how we handle passwords. So hashed is a one-way hashing function. It's not, you can't retrieve the value back. It just, the value goes in and gets saved, and as it's getting saved, it gets hashed and persisted to the database in a hashed form. So the original data cannot be retrieved. This is perfect for passwords because we can, during the login process, we can enter a candidate password, hopefully the correct password. We can hash it using the same algorithm, and if the hashes match, then we're good. We know the passwords match. So this is strictly a hashing function. This is not for encrypted data. That is a feature that's in the roadmap, but does not exist right now. Unique requires that the value in this field for this record is unique across all records in the database. So basically, it checks to make sure that this field is unique. This is convenient for, I think the impetus for this was originally in the email address for users. So all users need to have a unique email address. All users also have to have a unique username. So that's where this uniqueness comes in. And then default value and update on every save. And these two settings work very similarly. The big difference is that the default value gets populated if the field doesn't have a value, whereas update on every save literally updates on every save. So whether the field already has a value or not, this expression will be evaluated, and whatever value it creates will get saved in that field. So obviously we use this for created by and updated by. So created by, the default value is current user ID. Updated by, the updated on every save value is current user ID. So those are expressions that get evaluated either if the field has no value, which in the case of this default value, it means when the record is created, this default value expression will get evaluated, and the current user's ID will get saved to that field. Update on every save means that every single time I save this record, the current user's ID will get evaluated and saved to the updated by field. Similarly, created date and updated date have a similar mechanism, but instead of current user ID, it's current date time. And then another item I have here is the default value for prospect status should be new. That's part of my workflow. That's something that I've defined that kind of makes sense here. And I don't think that needs any additional explanation. So that's basically all the settings that you can change for a given field. Now, I did promise that I would show you what an object looks like, but first a list. So if I choose list here, I get a sub field called item in parentheses, and I can specify the type of the items within that list. So in this case, contacts is a list of GUIDs. So list obviously has no additional options, but then the item within that list does have the options. It has the type, it has whether it's editable or not, and so on and so forth. So let's look at something that has an object. And I believe if we go over to opportunities, yeah, here we go. So we actually have an object within a list here. So we have tasks, which is a list. The type of the item is object. And basically by selecting object, what I get is the option to create a bunch of fields. Basically like what I see at the top level schema, but within this object field here. So then I can specify the things that have to do with a task. So basically I've created my own type within this schema. So due date assigned to description, and of course those being fields just like everything else have their own properties as well. So description can be multi-line or not. In this case I chose it not to be multi-line. I don't know if that really makes sense, but it's something that you can change and something that I can make a decision about later that won't negatively impact anything. Due date is date time, assigned to is GUID. All of these are editable, and this GUID field assigned to is a foreign key into the users collection. So that's basically how schemas work. There's a lot of functionality packed into not a lot of space, but very efficiently laid out so that you can have all of the control right at your fingertips and see everything that's going on right here. So hopefully that gave you a good idea of what's going on with collections and how to define your own schemas to validate and provide the UI for those collections. That's very important. The UI is generated based on the schema that you provide for a collection. If you want more information about Slingshot, how it can work for your organization, and even where we're going in the future, some of the product roadmap items that we have. I mentioned some of them in the video, but there's many more on the horizon. We've got several releases planned out over the next year and even into the future. So if you want more information on that, be sure to send us an email, drop us a line. You can also comment below, but we might not share too much in the way of product roadmap details down there. But if you have questions, be sure to leave a comment below. And of course, like this video if you found this useful and helpful. Subscribe to the channel for the next videos that we're going to be getting into. Again, we've started with the bottom layer, but we're gradually going to build up throughout that conceptual architecture diagram that I showed at the beginning of the video. And be sure to check out our backlog of previous videos where we've kind of started at the beginning and now we're working through some of the other information that builds on some of those concepts in Slingshot. So be sure to subscribe, be sure to click that notification bell so you'll know when the next videos are coming out. And share this with other people in your organization or other people you might want to work with on Slingshot, building it into your organization. And if you have any questions at all, leave a comment below, shoot us an email. We'd love to find out more about how you use your systems like this and if Slingshot might be a good fit for your organization. Thanks for watching and have a great week.